Alright, time for another giraffephysics.com, debatephysics.com also, but can't get anyone to engage with anything stated as a proposition with reasonable arguments, counter arguments to anything stated in videos like this. So, AlphaPhoenix is making a video on electricity, so this would be like the Veritasium thing, he's going to make some claims. And really, is there any reasonable way to debate these premises or axioms or statements about how it works? So, so far so good. I mean, I got through 4 minutes, 10% of the video without disagreeing. And then he went and did it. Started talking about drift velocity, which is just a made-up nonsense kind of a concept. Electrons aren't like water atoms. Maybe I'll explain first, and then we can listen to it, and I'll point out how there's just no recognition that these aren't the same things. So the fact is that you can use a water analogy, as I have, frankly, to describe pretty well what happens with electricity. And electricity is pretty much okay. It's going to be the same as water, and then water is going to be the same as something else. And frankly, this all comes down to the whole, idea of velocity versus amperage, which is speed versus mass, which is basically mass, and velocity, which is mv, which is momentum, which runs the universe. And there's no reason for kinetic energy in electrical systems, and there's no reason for it in water systems. You're not going to make the water wheel spin twice as fast by using half the amount of water at twice the voltage. It doesn't happen, but let's not care about that. I mean, the truth doesn't matter here anywhere, right? All right, so this idea of drift velocity is to sit there and say that, like water, okay, it's just about the volume. All the volume has to move. So if I move one water molecule, I have to move all of them because they're all stuck to each other. So I'm always stuck with some idea I have to drag every single one. So water has a drift velocity because it's all the water molecules have to move. But electrons don't. They're not all going to move when you move something in a wire. When you put pressure into the wire, I'd say obviously right from the very beginning that it travels almost at the speed of light. Something like 3/4 of the speed of light you can get anyway. So that all of it isn't moving. It's getting there at the speed of light, the signal, the first impulse telling you have electricity, okay? The first indication of an uptrend in your voltage gets there very, very fast. So all of the electrons aren't doing it. And so the logic is just understand that electrons aren't stuck to each other. They don't drag all of them along. So whenever electricity happens, you could argue there's just a zillions of these little things. And all that really happened is a pathway happens. This electron, this electron, this electron, this electron moves, but the rest don't. The rest of them couldn't care less. And this is a billion to one kind of thing, okay? 1 out of the billion of the electrons is actually carrying the electricity, is actually pushing another electron in this new direction. This one is replacing this one replaces this one, that kind of thing. There's only a very tiny percentage in the wire that are doing that. That's why high voltages work, is because you're not moving a whole bunch of the electrons. You're applying a high pressure, a high velocity, getting the electrons to do this pushing thing very rapidly and efficiently, and therefore the whole wire doesn't get hot. And if you use a low pressure but a high amperage, well, yeah, that means you're going to move lots of electrons, so you're going to have lots of these little electrical connections. You're going to have lots of lightning bolts going through the wire, and therefore you're going to disrupt a lot of atoms. A lot of atoms are going to be broken because you're going to turn them into ions essentially by moving their electrons. You're certainly going to be in the displacement process, right? When the electron is pushed, it moves from this position to this position, right, in the moving process. So there's a point where there's no electron here, right? This one starts pushing on this one starts to leave. That means there's no electron here for a while. essentially creating a temporary ion here. And all of that means that the electrons, the atoms that are connected to each other, are going to start to break down because they aren't connected to each other. The electron they're sharing is moving to some new location. So it's not being a very good piece of glue anymore. And so that's why amperage heats a wire. That's why amperage creates magnetism, because frankly it changes how the wire looks to the world. The world looks at the wire and it's going to see something different the more atoms you move. The more atoms you move, the more you make this surface different, and the photons will bounce off of it differently. And frankly, you're going to be creating a polarized image, a magnetized image. Anyway, yeah, that's probably enough. So yeah, I've gone into all this stuff in more detail in other videos, and so you'll have to go find those if you're interested. But the fact is, the drift velocity is completely made up notion. It doesn't have anything to do with really doing science or anything, because you have no evidence that all the electrons are moving, that they're sharing their movement, that they're all connected to each other and have to all move when one moves. None of that happens. So it's just not a logical thing to even talk about. It doesn't mean anything. It has no meaning as a fact, and it's not a fact. So on both there's two good reasons not to use this concept or even think about the idea of the drift velocity, because it doesn't happen and it doesn't mean anything. It can't mean anything because it doesn't happen, frankly. But okay, we'll play his video.
There's an amp running through it right now, which means that there are literally 6.2 million electrons being shoved into the wire every second at this end, and 6.2 million electrons being pulled out of the wire every second at this end.
So that part is true. And so what he's really saying is there's a trillion total electrons. So the wire itself contains a billion times more electrons than he just described as the ones going through the wire. And that's true. But he didn't put those two facts together and say, well, why am I talking about the ones not moving? Because frankly, that's what they're doing. They're not moving.
Now, if you look at how many mobile electrons are already contained within this wire, which is a lot,
so again, this mobile electrons, that's not really what you're counting. You're counting the total number of electrons, not just mobile ones. So that's what you're dividing the motion into, is all the electrons in the wire. You're saying every single electron is part of the process, when no, only the ones moving are part of the process.
And 6.2 million electrons doesn't seem to go as far. The average electron is only...
So the average electron, there's no concept, there's no reason to even think about what the average electron is doing, because it has absolutely nothing to do with what the unaverage ones are doing. And it's what the unaverage ones are doing that matters. The ones that are moving the electricity are going near the speed of light. The ones that aren't going anywhere. Huge, gigantic difference between what these two electrons are doing. So why would I create some bastardized average and say the bastardized average is what an electron is doing in the wire? It's not. High amperage, lots of electrons are involved. Low amperage, high voltage, very few electrons are involved.
Only moving, scooching forward very slowly through this wire.
So he just said it. They're scooching very slowly through the wire. Nothing is scooching very slowly through the wire. There's only two choices. Electrons that aren't moving at all, more than their normal jitter, and electrons that are moving really, really fast. And that's all you have. You have those two choices. You don't have any scooch.
About a millimeter every 4 seconds.
So again, useless number. Nothing's moving a millimeter every 4 seconds. Nothing real in that wire is moving a millimeter every 4 seconds. Nothing is doing this average. There's only the two extremes. Doing absolutely nothing. Most of the electrons, 99.999% of the electrons are doing absolutely nothing. And it's only a tiny percentage that are doing lightning bolt transitions through. So it's just like lightning. Lightning's a tiny percentage of the atmosphere. Tiny percentage, right? You could take a radius of 1 mile, and one lightning bolt goes through. Well, a gigantic amount of electricity is transferred, but it's not transferred through all the atmosphere. It's transferred through one little tiny bit of the atmosphere. Most of the water molecules in the atmosphere, most of the ions in the atmosphere aren't doing anything. Okay, it's only a tiny percentage that are carrying electricity.
That means that if I left this on for a few hours, I would not only risk burning my house down, I would also very slowly replace all of the electrons in this wire.
So he just said, replace all of them. Now, why would you say that? You don't have any scientific evidence indicating that you're replacing all the electrons, especially the ones you could imagine inside the nucleus, which would be the electrons associated with, say, the neutrons. So there's an electron that's tied to a neutron, okay? I mean, it's just, in my opinion, a fact that that's what neutrons decay into, an electron and a proton. The electron's there. It's a real thing. You certainly didn't replace those. So all this talk that you replaced every single electron in the wire, nowhere near it. Not even close. You just moved a lot of electrons as the lightning bolt does. You didn't move all of the atmospheric atoms. No, it didn't happen.
With new electrons that came from inside the power supply.
So it's just, why would you say it? Why is this a point? Why do you people think this? Why does this mean anything? Well, he sits there and says, look, actually, because some of them diffuse backwards randomly, some of them hit dirt, against the drift, it would take 2 to 3 hours to replace 99% of the electrons. So again, none of the electrons, 99% of the electrons are not replaced. 99% are in rigid positions, locked inside of the atoms. If you could replace them, if you could hit them out, guess what? You could make nuclear bombs really easy then.
Electrons are indistinguishable fundamental particles, so whatever. No, if I...
So you say whatever, but it's sort of important distinction. But yes, you're even conceding that your own stupid point that you didn't need to make about some stupid notion of drift velocity or averaging two very different things. I mean, averaging Little Bo Peep and Frankenstein. You have very different things happening to the individual electrons, and you're basically saying, let's come up with an average for absolutely no good reason.
Increase the current flowing through this wire. Now we have roughly 4 amps flowing through this wire.
So that means you've increased the mass that's now involved carrying lightning bolts. So now there's more atoms in the atmosphere carrying the lightning bolts, and that just means more of them are getting disrupted, and yes, the whole thing's going to start getting hot.
That means that the average speed of an electron chugging its way around this...
So he's saying it again, the average speed. Who cares about the average speed? You didn't increase the pressure in the wire. Well, I guess you might have to increase the amperage. But regardless, the point is why would you talk about the average? It's not, who cares what the average is doing? The important fact is what are the ones that are actually moving through the wire doing?
This wire is about 1 millimeter per second. The drift...
So again, why do this? So 1 amp is 0.25 millimeters. So we know nothing's moving that fast. We know some things are moving the speed of light, just about. So some of the voltage, some of the electrons are moving at nearly the speed of light. And the real catch is that we can't measure the time it takes. We don't have it. All we can measure basically is an average speed. We can't really measure the individual speed of electrons, but the argument could be made that some electrons are going really straight line paths, and some electrons are just taking a little bit of a jitter, like a lightning bolt. So you're going to kind of understand the straighter the lightning bolt, the faster it's going to get to the Earth. The more crooked it is, okay, it's going to take a little longer. But when you're talking about really, really fast, who cares if it's a little longer?
The velocity of the electrons, the average speed as they move around the loop, is linearly proportional to the current.
So again, it's just a silly number that doesn't mean anything. It's an average you never should have even bothered thinking about because it's not water molecules. All the electrons aren't moving, so why are you talking about what all the electrons are doing? They're not doing what you're saying they're doing. And it breaks the whole idea of understanding pressure and mass. So the analogy to pressure and mass is broken by the idea that you're turning this into water and it doesn't behave like water. Thin wires can carry very high wattages. Thin pipes can't.
And now this is starting to smell and smoke, so I'm turning it off. As these electrons move through the wire, they do so with some friction. That's one of the reasons that they chug along so slowly.
So again, they don't chug along so slowly. We already know they go chugging very fast. I mean, all computer technology wouldn't work if they were going slowly. So why are you saying it? What good does this do? So he says here, pseudo-functional force that slows down electrons in a wire and dissipates electrical energy as heat. So all it dissipates is more movement. It's basically going, something hits an atom, okay, where it can't push the electron, so it has to push the whole atom, and that's where the problems come in. So now you start to move the atoms, and as you move the atoms, you degrade the material and start to turn it into a liquid.
It's also why this started to get hot and singe all of these pieces of tape that I had on here a second ago. The classical view of electrical resistance is like a Plinko board, where electrons want to move from one side to the other, but there's stuff in the way.
Alright, so this classical description also just shows that the electrons are individual electrons. They're not taking all of the electrons with them. They're not drifting through the Plinko board. So again, this would be a good analogy if you didn't, if you actually paid attention to it and recognized that, yes, all the electrons are not drifting through the wire. The conductor is just like a big giant hunk of atmosphere, and the lightning bolt will choose a path through that big hunk of atmosphere. The conductor is a big thing. The pathway taken by the electrons is going to be a tiny thing.
Atomic nuclei. This Plinko model isn't as good as the water model, but I think
it's better, because the fact is, again, the water molecule always restricts you. It's basically dictating you can't put more water, okay, and just have something travel through the water. The water won't allow you to hit it and allow just certain water molecules to carry your pressure. You have to drag all of them. So you can never do an analogy where you have the same circumstance, the same thickness of pipe, and you send a high voltage versus a low voltage through the same pipe. You can't do it. The water analogy forces you to restrict the volume to show the example. You can't put high pressure through high volume, where in a conductor, of course you can. You can put your 10,000 volts through almost anything. It doesn't matter how big the wire is, the voltage will go through it just fine.
Can demonstrate the effect of resistance really well. The slightly more subtle point is that while these electrons are indeed driven from one side to the other by an external force that we'll talk about in a minute, the lattice they collide with is continuously vibrating. With every given collision, an electron may gain kinetic energy or lose kinetic.
Oh, so he's using this kinetic energy thing, which is a terrible model. Okay, it's going to gain or lose momentum because that's all there really is. And the fact is it's not going to really be bothered that much by these atomic jitters, because the individual electrons it's going to hit, okay, are moving so much slower than it is. All right, so the vibration speed of the electrons is a lot slower than the actual voltage pressure. The movement of the electrons that are moving very fast for, little tiny periods, and that very fast movement is so fast that the jitter is almost not happening from their perspective. So that doesn't work either. Alright, well, I really want this to be about drift velocity. I think he's probably done talking about drift velocity, we'll assume. I haven't played the rest of the video, so I have no idea what the other mistakes are going to be. I like the idea that he's conceding that water produces a very good analogy, and I would argue that water basically proves there's no such thing as the kinetic energy he just described, because water says I can't put things in a smaller pipe and make more energy. So even though I've increased the velocity of the water molecules, I'm creating more kinetic energy, It won't show up at the other end. There won't be any extra wattage produced because I had molecules that are stuck to each other. And that's the big giant difference. So another argument that will go unresponded to in any way, and it's just a pitiful truth that science can't be challenged. They won't allow the challenge to take place. All of these little dogmatic axioms have to be accepted, and nobody can be even inspired to think differently. You can't even peep the words Darwin, because the Jesus theory must be defended. So anyway, till the next time and such.